Thanks, Will. So it's nice to see everyone here. Just a reminder that we have coffee and cookies up front. It is a little funny to be doing an introduction for someone who really doesn't need an introduction, but I thought that I would highlight maybe some aspects of his biography that may not be as well known. So Dave Skelly is the Frank R. Oastler Professor of Ecology. Since 2014, he's been the director of the Peabody Museum of Natural History. And when you look at Dave's CV and all of his contributions to Yale, it basically reads like the iconic, someone who's just made major contributions, not only in terms of Yale, but FES, Yale NUS. I mean, he's basically been a model citizen in terms of all his contributions across the university. Dave did his bachelor's at Middlebury, and afterwards he went to University of Michigan, where he got a PhD in biology. And after that, he went to Australia for a year, and I discovered in his publication list that he had written papers on invasive species in Australia, like the cane toad. So his interest in pond amphibians go way back. Before he became the director of Peabody, he was also the curator of the Division of Vertebrate Zoology for many years over at the Peabody. And at FES, he was for many years the Associate Dean for Research and the director of the doctoral program. And it wasn't until he was plucked by the Peabody that then I stepped into very big shoes to fill. He's won a number of different awards, among them a Guggenheim Fellowship. He has helped, I mentioned this a little bit earlier, he's already helped establish the Environmental Studies program at Yale NUS. He's won teaching awards at FES, not once, not twice, not 3 times, but 4 times, which is quite a feat. He's published on a range of topics, things ranging from evolutionary responses to climate change, and I think this may be my favorite title, Universal Ecological Patterns in College Basketball Communities. So he's really quite a widely published scholar. And when you look at who has funded Dave's research, it ranges from the usual suspects like EPA and National Science Foundation, but also the National Institute for Health, the Department of Defense, the Center for Disease Control. So I think in many ways he's really an exemplar scholar for our students. So without any more ado, please welcome Dave Skelly.
Thank you. So thanks, Karen. Melanie very wisely conducted a test with this presentation. We've gone to the new No Lunch program, and by combining that early on with a talk on frogs, you kind of get an idea of the minimum audience expected. So I was actually thinking quite the opposite, that I've been pretty scarce around here for the last couple of years, just kind of getting my feet under me in a new role over the museum. So I felt like very much I have to introduce myself to a community that can turn over pretty quickly, especially among the student ranks. And so the next slide is actually directed at the students by way of saying something about myself that even if you forget anything about the frogs, maybe you'll remember this. So this is a picture of me when I was, I don't know, a year and a half or something. And there are 2 things I want you to take away from this. First, start reading the literature early and learn how to multitask. You can also learn something about my family here. My mother put this in an album, but of course she wanted it to be G-rated, so she cut the picture into, so there would be, she didn't know what the world would look like in 2017 for sure. So anyway, what I'm going to do now with some trepidation with Karen sitting here is set my talk up by talking a little bit about urbanization, because the world that I find to be extremely important and also scientifically really interesting exists on this physical and conceptual boundary between undeveloped, pristine wilderness, whatever we want to call it today, and developed landscapes. So this suburban frontier, you might call it, is where a lot of the action is happening in a lot of different ways. You could be forgiven for thinking that suburbs are a really kind of old-fashioned topic, and we really shouldn't be talking about that at all, because of course all of us within a few years are going to become artisanal chocolate makers in Brooklyn. But and sorry, Andis, I didn't mean to flag some people who look exactly like you here. Nevertheless, the reality of the situation is that for better and for worse, suburbs are still eating the planet. In the U.S. here, densities in cities in the surrounding kind of inner ring suburbs, density of people keeps declining. That's a measure of people kind of spreading out, even as the total population of humans continues to increase. The fraction of the population in the suburbs is increasing. There was a blip for a few years during the recession, and this is where the Brooklyn idea came around, where cities were growing faster than suburbs. But as we've come out of the recession, the old norms are reasserting themselves. And so I guess what I would assert is that there's something about the suburbs, something almost Goldilocks-like, where they're not too crowded, they're not too rural, they're this in-between thing. And for a lot of people, they offer the right combination of environmental factors, that they want to live in. People choose their habitats. And there's something that is popping up in the U.S. here, and I'll talk about it in a second, and elsewhere as well. So what that means for the rest of the biodiversity in this world is that an increasing fraction of the world is going to be subject to this conversion of landscapes. And so one manifestation of that is that you get a continuing decline in forested area and conversion to a lot of things, including residential areas like the ones we work in. Unless we think this is just an American thing, this is also happening around the world as countries in the developing world become more affluent. So this is actually not in Southern California, that's in China, and in Bangalore, and in other places around the world, Brazil. As people become more affluent, they want to spread out. So there's something there that we just have to deal with. And historically, people in my world of ecology and conservation have tended to say, don't. And that has been an abject failure. During the same period where that message was going out, all these trends I've just been talking about have continued as fast or faster than ever. So now what I want to do, after showing you pictures from all these glorious places, is kind of bring it back here to Connecticut, where we do a lot of our work, and talk about how that lands here and what it means. So this figure has a lot going on in it. It's showing a timeline from 1650 to 2000. This is percent of the landscape that is in forest cover for all the New England states, and then this curve is just showing population, up to 100% of the population as of 1990. So it just shows you the shape of the curve. And what you can see here is that there's some stuff going on here. So let's break that down. So I've highlighted in particular the curve for Connecticut, and there's 3 phases I'll talk about very quickly. So the initial phase that's covered here is not coincidentally grounded around the time that European colonization happened. The presumption from this study that forest cover was 100% is wrong. We know that. There was clearing going on by Native Americans well before this. In fact, there's a really great historical account of somebody riding along the New England coastline quite a distance. I think it was like Boston down to New Haven and beyond, without having to get off their horse. So the idea being that the country was open enough for them to do that. So this first phase, though, as indicated here, is pretty clear what was going on, is that the landscape was being cleared predominantly for agriculture, and that this peaked around the middle of the 19th century, and that's when urbanization really takes off. The Industrial Revolution, which for the United States was in many ways born right here in Connecticut, really takes off. People abandon farms. They move into these cities at the same time that railroads and steamboats are making it easier to get agricultural produce and other products from the Midwest. as settlement is happening in another part of the country where you don't have to lift 80 pounds of rocks out of the ground to dig a post hole. And that continues apace up until the middle of the 20th century, and then we get this inflection back down again that's continued to today. So we went through this period of reduction in forest cover from 1650 to about 1850, then from 1850 to 1950 or so, the forests are regrowing, and then the world is becoming more affluent. Suburbs really take off as we become an automobile economy, and Mr. Blandings builds his dream house. And does anybody know where that was filmed? Connecticut, of course. And that's continued to today, and now the forest cover is continuing to decline. So we can be bummed out about this, and we should in some ways, but really what we have to do is deal with it. And to deal with it, I think it's very important to understand what's at stake right now. And what's at stake right now is that probably what we have today, right now, for wildlife in the northeastern United States is better than it's been probably since the 1850s. And you don't have to take my word for it, and you don't even have to take the Boston Globe's word for it. Here's Henry David Thoreau writing in 1854 in his journals, "Is not the muskrat the heaviest animal found wild in this township?" And he's writing in Concord, Massachusetts. In Concord, Massachusetts today, there are routine sightings of black bear, of moose, of bobcat. There's fishers. There's all these species that people presume, turkey, that were going to be gone forever, that have gradually reinvaded, mostly on their own. Wildlife agencies around the states and the federal wildlife folks have done a little bit, but especially in New England, where the federal land footprint is so minimal, it's mostly just happened on its own, and it's continuing to happen. So I would say that we absolutely don't want to rest on our laurels. In fact, it's quite the other way, that we have a really wonderful situation, but a precarious one. Connecticut, out of all of the 50 U.S. states, I'll get these backwards. So I think it's third highest forest cover in the country out of the 50 states, fourth highest in human population density. So where does that give? Where are we headed? And what do we want the world to look like? So my research program has a few elements to it. They're all grounded in my background as an ecologist studying populations and communities, both at local scales, like one frog, one pond at a time, up to landscape scales, and trying to find ways to integrate those. I'm going to talk some about that work today, and I'm also going to talk about how that work eventually transitioned in part into a study of how evolutionary responses are very important to understand how the world looks today, and maybe even more importantly, what it's going to look like in the future. I also talk quite a bit about sex. I'm sorry, I'm not going to do that today. That'll be for another time. I left that as a teaser for another talk, maybe. So we're gonna stay on the right-hand side here and just get into it. Now, this is an example of a study that we did up in northeastern Connecticut, working in a gradient that went to, many people in this room have been to Yale Myers Forest. That's what is representing undeveloped landscapes here, through suburban areas like Tolland, Connecticut, and Manchester. And what this is showing on the y-axis is just, if you walk into a pond, as we often do, and you just say, how many amphibian species are in there, this is what you see. And I would say, a good 80 to 90% of ecology, the kind of ecology of wildlife species that people do is of this ilk, where you say, look how bad that is. We're going from having 5 species per pond down to a couple. We're losing biodiversity. That has been chronicled in thousands of studies over and over again. But the story most often ends there. And what is much more interesting to me, now that we know this ad nauseum, is how does it happen? And then what could you possibly do differently so that it doesn't need to look like this? So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to jump to work that I didn't do, but it's set up a more recent study that we did do. But it's work done by a Yale student and an alum of this school, James Gibbs, who is currently at State University of New York in Syracuse at ESF. And he's one of the top conservation biologists out there. So when he was a graduate student here, he did some work down near West Campus, in fact. West Campus is about right here. This is a transect that he set up that was 2 kilometers wide and 10 kilometers long and spans a range, I'll show you in a second, of forest cover where when he's doing this in the early 1990s, this is almost 100% forest cover up in the upper right, and this gets down to close to 0% forest cover. And what he was interested in doing in his studies on amphibians is take that bulk pattern, like I just showed you in the last slide, and break it down by species and just ask, what does this look like? So here's what forest cover looks like. So these are surveys at, I think it's 1 hectare blocks that were either delineated as forested or not. And you can see in the upper right corner, you have a lot of contiguous forest cover, and it kind of peters out. And what's filling in the rest of that environment is predominantly residential and some commercial landscapes. So he looked at a number of different amphibian species represented here. This is only for the older people here who remember that bad Kevin Costner movie, Field of Dreams. If you build it, they will come. And if you take it away, they will disappear. So this is the upper right-hand end of this transect that's mostly forested. This is the developed end. And for spring peepers moving kilometer by kilometer down there, they are the cockroaches of the amphibian world, and they'll live right down next to car dealerships and whatever else. They get in and can live just about anywhere. Wood frogs that I'm going to talk a lot about, and spotted salamanders that I'll talk some about as well, don't fare as well. They make it a little over halfway, and then they cough out. And then the most sensitive species is the red-spotted newt. Now, what interested James about this when he was doing this work 20-odd years ago is if you were to arrange these species by their ability to disperse, this species would be the best. In other words, its movement patterns on its own in an unmodified landscape would tell you this one is the one that can really move. It can go really long distances. This species has 2 metamorphoses. The first one is from a larval form into the elusive red eft that you can kind of see when you're hiking around and it's rainy. And these things are bright red-orange. They're also incredibly toxic. That's not a coincidence. And they stay in that form for several years. And that phase, that juvenile phase, gives them time to move. And they do seem to move. And then they metamorphose again into an adult form that's aquatic. When they get back into the water, these things can all be found in the same pond. So their habitat requirements aren't identical, but they overlap. So this pattern is probably not because there's fewer ponds for newts down here, at least not solely. So there's some difference in tolerance. So rather than just saying suburbs bad, what James is doing here is trying to parse that a bit. And when I first read this paper, that really captured me, the fact that we maybe can start learning more about individual species, and by understanding how one species succeeds where another one doesn't, we may be able to learn important lessons. So now what I'm going to show you is James ponds along that transect. And in 1993, this was the boundary, the physical boundary between the places where wood frogs were found, all up in here, and where they were absent. And so a few years ago, Alex Shepak, who was a master's student in the lab, led a study to resurvey James's ponds. James gave us all of his data and cooperated really wonderfully with us, and that way we kind of knew where we were and what we were doing, and could go back to these exact locations. Now, what I'm going to show you next is the exception rather than the rule to the story of what happened. So this horrible picture is what we had for remote sensing, Karen, in 1991. I mean, maybe there's better stuff out there. But this grainy picture is a picture of a site that was in an undeveloped location in the early 1990s. And then this is that exact same location today. So, anyone want to guess if wood frogs are still there? They are not. And what else is interesting is, there's no permit that allowed them to do this. These little ponds are so small that they can get kind of filled and buried without anybody even noticing sometimes. So, wood frog population lost. There was a fair amount of development in that transect during the intervening 20 years between when the early study was done and when we revisited these places. Nevertheless, here's the 1993 boundary. If you think about the stories that conservation scientists like to tell, what, say, Dave Tillman would have said is, this boundary that we looked at in 1993, that embodies extinction debt. In other words, because most of the development that we're looking at here probably happened, at least the residential development, post 1958-59 when I-95 was put in and these towns became driving automobile suburbs, that line should continue to move north because there are zombie populations there that are just hanging on, but they're going to cough out. So that was really one of the motivations for doing this work. But what we found was that the boundary really didn't move very much. There's only one population extinction that defines the difference between the 1993 line and the 2013 line. That's about as close to not moving as you can imagine. It certainly didn't increase. So that's really interesting. And it begs the question to us about what it is about this environment that makes it inhospitable for a species that up here is doing quite well, and for which it seems like maybe the difference is somewhat stable somehow. So that leads to a more general consideration of why species like amphibians disappear from these landscapes, but instead of treating it as a generalized phenomenon, getting in this case with one species and really digging in. And what I'll talk about for the next little bit in particular is maybe what goes on in a pond as opposed to what goes on between, with a whole bunch of ponds, or what goes on between the ponds in terms of fragmentation or connectivity issues. I'll come back to that though. And so what we did was an experiment, and we asked whether the pattern that we see is because those ponds down south that are sitting next to high schools and car dealerships, and they're full of shopping carts and headless Barbie dolls, and they've got that nice sheen on the surface. Maybe they're just really nasty places to be, and it's not habitat for these guys. So we did a field experiment. We used the distribution of the species as we observed it, and as we know that it also existed in 1993, 20 plus years ago. And then we asked, is performance distinct between these areas? And I'll cut to the chase and tell you, no. Headless Barbie ponds do quite well in terms of survival, in terms of body size at metamorphosis, and in terms of developmental rate. And in fact, the only one of these differences that had anything close to significance was developmental stage or an estimate of developmental rate, and that was teeny tiny biased towards the ponds where they don't normally live. That may be because of more open canopy and slightly warmer temperatures. These are ectotherms, and so maybe they were able to develop a little bit faster. We don't know that, and that's not a big enough difference to get too excited about. But certainly there's no evidence that these ponds can't support this species that is otherwise absent. So that pushes the question, what's going on here? Another way we looked at this is to look at these dynamics. I showed you a picture of one extinction, but what went on more generally? And I'll just use two species here, the spotted salamander that I introduced before and the wood frog that I'm going to talk about a bunch. Between the two of them, there were 3 instances of invasion. So someplace that they weren't present in the early 90s that we found them. And there were 6 instances of extinctions. So more extinctions than invasions. Now I'll explain what these numbers in parentheses are. We were very interested in the notion when we started this study of looking at extinction debt. Extinction debt, I explained, is you make a change in the environment, and it takes, because the demography of animals and plants isn't instantaneous, it takes them a while to catch up. That's the debt. But you can also have a recovery debt. So if the world has actually been improving for a long time, it can take a while for animals to catch up to that. Interestingly, conservation scientists really hardly ever study that. We're a gloomy bunch. We wanted to look at both. And what I'm showing here is the number of these. There were 3 extinctions. In 2 cases, extinction debt doesn't apply because those are the places where the pond was obliterated, like it's just gone, or somebody dredged it out and put goldfish in it. Some massive change happened. In other words, there was a recent change to the pond that either made it disappear or made it a much different habitat. And for 2 out of the 3 cases with the spotted salamander, that explained the extinctions. And for all of the wood frog cases, it explained the extinctions. Okay? So we're left with a situation where in this system, in one of the few cases where we've got good historical data and we can look at this at all, this isn't a large number of instances, but I can tell you there's not a lot out there. It certainly doesn't look like extinction debt is overwhelming recovery debt. And so we asked, why is that? And one way that we looked at this is to look at, as I mentioned, the world became more developed in between this world became more developed between 1993 and 2013. And so what we were able to do for both then and now is estimate the threshold of tolerance of this species for development using a buffer of 200 meters around the pond and taking a geographic information system on land use and land cover and saying X% of this landscape falls into a developed land class and Y% falls into undeveloped. And what you can see we reanalyzed using the land use information from 1990, what things looked like then when James was doing this work. And in this case, the estimated threshold between where a wood frog can live and where it can't is about 24% urbanization, defined this way. That threshold in between time increased to 35%. And I'm not showing you the data, but the same thing happened for spotted salamanders. So it looks like if we were to do a study like this as a one-off, and then from high on our conservation scientist mountain say, this is the threshold that you should aim for. And we had done that in 1990, and we would have said, you have to have at least 25%. It changed over time, and they became more tolerant of urbanization than they were. And the same thing happened for spotted salamanders. So that could be a kind of an artifact of recovery debt. These things were recovering and we're just catching up, or the species changed in between time. And I'll talk a little bit about both those possibilities. So these questions, the one I just said, are species, at least in part, are species getting better at dealing with urbanization over time? Is that an even reasonable thing to think might be going on? And then we've pushed the question. that experiment was, in essence, a negative result. The terrible ponds aren't terrible. So what is it? If it's not the conditions in the ponds themselves, what could it be? And so I'll handle these in turn, and then that'll be all for today. The first one I want to talk about is rapid evolution in amphibians. And Karen very helpfully mentioned that I had worked on cane toad invasion in Australia. I'll talk about that for just a couple of slides. And then I'm going to talk about wood frogs and canopy. And in both of these cases, with taxa, in different ends of the amphibian or the anuran phylogeny, we've got evidence that rapid evolution can take place. So for cane toads, we worked with the best in the business on this. So Rick Shine and his then student, Ben Phillips, collaborated with us on a look at how cane toad invasion was rolling out. And whether that tells us anything about whether species can adapt to a novel landscape. Cane toads were introduced to Australia in 1935. Many of you will know the story. They were introduced to control pest species, the cane beetle. The toads are nocturnal, the beetle's diurnal. The larvae live in the stalks that the toad can never get into. I'm married to a Hawaiian, so I have to be very careful when I say this, but the Hawaiians sold them a bunch of junk. They had these, sorry, she's here, she's mad at me. They already knew that this didn't work, but the Queenslanders paid a lot of money because they were desperate. There were outbreaks of this cane beetle, and throwing a few toads on the ground seemed like, what else are we gonna do? So the early efforts to try to understand, and if you go to Australia, cane toads, with everything that has been introduced into Australia and all the issues they have, cane toads occupy a disproportionate proportion of the bandwidth because they're not just invasive species out there. If you walk out into your backyard in Australia, like in the little scrim of Australia where almost everybody lives on the coast, there are cane toads in your backyard. And people have parties where they go out there with pillowcases, and everybody fills up their pillowcase with cane toads, and then they put them in the freezer at the end of the night. That's how they have fun there. So it's the invasive species that in many ways people have the most familiarity with in their day-to-day lives. So when cane toads were first introduced, this is what people were thinking the introduced range would be. And let me just say that this is using the exact same analytical approach that is used right now today to say X number of species are going to go extinct because of climate change, or they're going to move here, or they're going to go there. This is what people do. This study was from 1995, but the current generation of models wouldn't give you much different sort of a projection. So using their native range, illustrated right here in Central and South America, you would expect cane toads to kind of hug this northeastern coast. This is kind of wet. This is kind of wet. This is all really dry, and cane toads shouldn't live there. Okay? So predicted range based on climatic envelope and native range. And here's the model that we created based on the bioclimatic envelope as of like 2007 when we were doing this work. And you can see that the area encompassed, total area encompassed, is about 3 times as big. And since we have done this work, they are indeed trucking down this coast right now. Okay? And the other thing we were able to show is that they accelerated. So this cold to hot gradient is the invasion rate. How many kilometers per year is the front moving? And you can see that it got hot right up here and started accelerating. And it accelerated and kept accelerating as they blew right by where they were supposed to be stopped. What I'm not going to show you today is that Rick Shine, Ben Phillips, and a bunch of folks associated with the cane toad group at the University of Sydney did incredible work showing not just 1 or 2 or 3, but like a dozen different ways that toads have evolved and are not at all like their forebears who are still living in Central and South America. These toads, if you've ever seen toads around here, wherever you're from, they mostly hop. These toads don't hop, they jump. They have longer legs. They can move farther in a night than any toad in Brazil would deign to do. And they do that because if they don't, they're dead. They have to move from wet spot to wet spot during the night. Otherwise, they cook into a little toad pancake. So it's very strong selection, and it's been going on since 1935. And sometime around the 1970s, one thing or a suite of things changed in the toads. So there's absolutely no question that this species, within the lifetime of a human, has changed into something else. That's an important lesson for invasion. It's an important lesson for thinking about what climate change does to species, because we're not moving species to a new continent with climate change, but what we are is taking where they live and giving them novel environments. But ecologists and conservation scientists, if you start talking about evolution and adaptation, they get squirmy. It's not easy to fit that concept into the way we normally think about conserving species, because what are you conserving? What are you expecting? Mark Bradford back there works on these little microby things that are evolving all the time, and so he's used to thinking about these things, what is even a species? That's not the way the rest of us in the vertebrate world tend to think about this. So that's work that we were involved in a very small way. This is work that we've started here and are continuing to today to try to understand whether species around here, like wood frogs, can do the same thing. So this study was the first of several to look at this issue, and it's based on studying a canopy gradient. So I've been working on canopy since I was a graduate student, because we noticed at a place in Michigan that I'll talk about in a minute that closed canopy environments had fewer species, wood frogs being an exception. So this is a whole set of ponds out at Yale Myers Forest, and here's a big news flash for you. Colder ponds have lower temperatures. We needed to show that. And that influences the development rate of these guys. So I'm showing that on a light gradient. This is low light to high light. This represents an average daily temperature gradient of 2 to 3 degrees. Daytime spikes are much bigger differences, up to 5 or 10 degrees C. And you can see that the embryonic period, the number of days to go from being laid as an egg and hatching, goes way up. It goes from 10 or 11 days up to 18 or 19 days. So that's a problem for these guys, because these ponds are simultaneously drying up. So when a frog egg hits the water in a vernal pond, it's in a race against the pond disappearing out from under them. Another strong selection pressure. And if it's colder, darker, colder, and the food is different, and everything that lower light levels can entail, that makes it tougher. So I want you to focus on the slope of this line, okay? So higher light, shorter time periods. Now what we did is we took these eggs and we brought them into incubators. And so they were from this whole range, but they're raised at the same temperatures. And I'll show you the same pattern for 2 different temperatures, 2 different incubators. So the axes here are the same. Here's the embryonic periods against global site factor. Everything with an open circle or a triangle was raised at the same temperature. And what this is showing you is that downward facing slope tipped up. What that means is that the frogs, the embryos that were laid from the coldest places develop the fastest. That's called countergradient variation. So by being an egg laid in a cold vernal pond, you're given a double whammy. Not only is the pond going to disappear out from under you, but you're going to be growing and developing slower. And so you've got these 2 things to deal with. One of the ways that they deal with it is that this species seems to be able to develop faster when its parents came from a cold, dark pond. Now, that could be for a variety of reasons. What I will argue is that at least some of this pattern is because these things have adapted. And notice that it's not just, there's the relationship here that we've also seen for other traits in other places, is one in which if you tell me the light level in a pond, I can estimate the development rate, right? That's something. If you know what ecological data normally looks like, you'll know why I'm so proud of that as you all just sit there. All right, and we didn't stop there. So we did embryonic development rate, we've done larval development rate, we've done critical thermal maximum, so that's a temperature at which animals can't survive anymore, and thermal preference behavior, and another group, Rick Relier's group, did a study of morphology relative to predation. All of these provide evidence that this species that lives all around us is able to evolve rapidly for all of these different traits. Pretty much everything we've thrown at them. And Andis right now is working on a resurvey that will take into account that we did this, that original study was done in 2001. So we went back this summer, when I say we, that was Andis, and he grabbed eggs from the same set of ponds. Those have changed in their light levels. Some of them have opened up, some of them have closed up, and we'll be able to see whether that pattern holds up or something else is going on. All right. So next steps in thinking about local extinction then. One of the things that we need to go back to, remember, the pond conditions are not the reason that wood frogs are absent. That doesn't seem to explain it. What about what's going on in between the ponds? And here's some evidence from work that we've done in Michigan in collaboration with Earl Werner and a bunch of other people to try to understand, using observational data, long-term observational data, how connectivity can matter to wildlife. So the chorus frog doesn't occur here in southern New England, but it's an abundant species across much of the Midwest. At the E.S. George Reserve at the University of Michigan, during my time there, it was declining. And we all thought that this species was going to go extinct, and in fact, by 1998, this is a map of a 1,400-acre area, it was down to just 2 populations. So we were figuring it was going to blink out because we're stupid ecologists. And then there was a drought, and we all thought, okay, this is it. Chorus frogs are going to be gone. And here's what it looked like by 2001. All those red dots are all the places that this thing exploded and moved into. And basically recolonized this whole area and became one of the more abundant species. So what is the answer for that? This species, the glorious mud minnow, was located in a couple of very large marshes. When the drought hit, the mud minnows got wiped out, they fish killed, and those became big, beautiful marshes that were loaded with tadpole food. And we had this massive demographic engine dropped right into the laps of this species that was almost gone. And they took full advantage of it and recolonized a huge area. So this is what this looks like. This is the number of places that chorus frogs were found before and during this drought. This is the number of ponds that were available to them. So that's fishless ponds that are non-permanent and open canopy, okay? So that really didn't change very much during the drought. This species develops very fast, and it turns out the drought was okay for it because the number of ponds that were becoming unavailable because they turned into puddles was matched by the number of big ponds that became small ponds. But the critical thing that happened around 2000 is that the mud minnows fish killed, they moved in there, and all of a sudden there were literally millions of chorus frog babies that spread all over the place, and low probability dispersal events happened because there were so many individuals, in a nutshell. And so what we saw happening is that the connectivity of this network increased. That is, the estimated number of individuals with 100 meters of a focal pond exploded. And so during this drought period, before the fish reconquered the wetland, they were able to maintain this situation. And in essence, what they did was to move up this curve, and I'll explain what this is. So this is the overall average density in a pond, And then this is the degree of occupancy across a network of ponds for wildlife. So this is an abundance occupancy curve. And animals fall somewhere along here. It's sort of one of these laws of macroecology that species that are highly locally abundant are also widely distributed, all right? Species that have low local abundances tend to be the ones that are not widely distributed. And what happened during this event is that the species climbed up this curve. This curve is actually showing for the 13 resident species where they sat on average during a long study period. They climbed up this curve because of what the fish kill did for them, and ever since then, they've been dropping back down. This ratchet has been dropping them down. Their local abundance has been dropping, and the connectivity has been dropping. And this has led us to think about the notion that these guys can exist in these alternate states, that you are either abundant and widely distributed, as we have like 4 or 5 species here, or you're down on this curve. And these species that are down on this curve, they're the ones that we see moving back and forth across the reserve. These are the ones that are vulnerable. So if I take everything that I've told you today and try to boil it down, I guess what I'd say is that what we're learning about individual species suggests that these issues of extinction are going to be very different for different species. The congener of the chorus frog, which was the other species that I worked on, the spring peeper, it didn't do anything like this. And if I gave you the 2 tadpoles, or probably the 2 adults, Jim would know the difference, but not many of you would be able to tell the difference between those 2 species. They look and act very similar, but these little differences in their larval behavior, in their development time, and so on, end up manifesting in huge ways here. And so there's an idiosyncrasy there that is going to make, general sort of truisms hard to use in conservation. And conservation folks love general truisms. Like if you read the macroecology literature, effectively what they're doing is they're laying down a distribution syndrome for not just one species, but say all species within whatever group they're studying. And what we're seeing here with an individual species is that over time, it can be distributed in different ways and have different kinds of metapopulation dynamics. And that the key is if the environment allows local success, you can maintain that connectivity and you can stay up here. But once you start sliding down here, you end up in this more precarious sort of a situation. And the other thing that we're going to have to wrap our heads around is, and I think with the coming revolution related to CRISPR technology and so on, and the ability to sequence whole genomes of species, maybe even in the field within 10 years, we're going to understand that these things that we've regarded as concrete entities in conservation, like a species, are really slippery. And that whether it's the Endangered Species Act or the latest program from World Wildlife Fund or so on, they don't take that into account. And there are places that are starting to wake up to this. The folks in Australia that are trying to save Tasmanian devils from a mouth cancer that's sweeping across the island are trying to work very closely with evolutionary biologists to save this species from being extinct in the wild, and recognizing that they're going to have to somehow help this species to evolve if it's going to survive. That's an intervention that can feel kind of uncomfortable to a lot of conservation scientists, but I think we're going to be forced into a corner to make these hard decisions. The part of it that I haven't been able to help you with at all today, but it's something we're still working on, is how do we create environments like suburban environments that will support species better. What the work that we have to date points to is connectivity is really important. Another alum from the lab, Steve Brady, worked on road ecology and the ways that roads in particular can reshape wood frogs and spotted salamanders. And he sees evolutionary responses to those, to being proximate to roads in both of those species. So the next step, in some ways, is going to be creating different kinds of suburbs, and then testing to see how the other species that have to occupy them respond to it. Because as I started off saying, a bigger and bigger fraction of the world is going to be suburbs, whatever that means. So with that, I want to thank a whole bunch of people, current and past, for helping us with this suburban research, and leave you with some wise words from one of our alums, Aldo Leopold, who in 1933 said, to build a better motor, we tap the uttermost powers of the human brain. To build a better countryside, we throw dice. And he said that in 1933, and I wish it was less true today. Thanks. Got a few minutes for questions. Liza.
So Dave, in terms of thinking about these species evolving in response, in particular to the canopy, differences in canopy openness, how much of that do you think is actually evolution versus just existing phenotypic plasticities and maternal effects? Since the frogs, there's going to be a good deal of variation in canopy openness existing, and then could that potentially, like knowing how much phenotypic plasticity there is based on what they're used to experiencing, if that can be used to make predictions about what novel environments they can and can't tolerate?
Right. So that's usually the first question every time I talk about this stuff. What Liza's saying is that part of what you're seeing there, we used a common garden experiment, which is a way to evaluate residual difference accounting for phenotypic plasticity, but maternal or parental effects in particular are non-genetic ways that parents can influence their offspring by provisioning eggs or all kinds of ways. And we can't eliminate that here. And the very helpful suggestions we've gotten from NSF grant reviewers is just raise them for multiple generations in the lab. Well, these things, it takes 2 or 3 years to raise these in the lab, and Lindsay is smiling right now because she's done it, and it's an enormous pain. And not just a pain, raising a population up for that long is very difficult. So we are left with a situation where we don't know, and I'm looking to be rescued by these next generation genetic techniques that will allow us to see directly what the evolved response is, if there is one, as well as what the aspects of the phenome look like that we can't see right now. Other questions? Pete.
So we know that land clearing, right, in agriculture can impact the prevalence of small ponds, or impact how many there are in the landscape. What do we know around here for how the prevalence has changed between what was a forest pre-anthropogenic and what's a forest now?
Yeah, so Meredith Holgerson very well, and she looked at that some. This was a doctoral student in the lab, and there's a pretty strong relationship between the density, housing density and wetland density, and there aren't very good longitudinal studies. There are some that look at ponds disappearing as residential development happens, but if you make the not ridiculous assumption that the original density was approximately equal across an area that was partially developed, there's a very clear and strong relationship. These ponds they have one of two fates. They very rarely stay in their original form. They either get obliterated, like that Bridgeport example I showed you, Bridgeport Development Corp., or they get scooped out and turned into something ornamental.
But how about like the land clearing that was occurring in like the 1700s?
It's not necessarily a different story. So in the original wave of European-induced, European colonist-induced clearing, the kinds of wetlands that vernal pond type or red maple swamps were not very useful, and so if they could be, they were converted, not to ornamental ponds, but to livestock watering ponds, and we see that all over the place. Or what we don't get to see in a very clear way is the ones they try to fill in. I live in Madison, and the town green was a red maple swamp that they took like 50 years to fill in. Anybody who had any fill would dump it on the commons until that got filled in so that today we can have concerts or something. One more question? Mark.
So, how representative do you think the cane toad example would be for other species? And the reason I'm asking is because of friendly release or maladaptive gene flow. So if it's a non-native and it arrives, it's potential that you're not getting genes from the parental population that would stop you adapting.
Yeah.
Or whether you think that kind of idea of maladaptive gene flow probably doesn't apply broadly.
So it's an excellent question. So the question is, how representative is the cane toad example? I can't remember the exact number. It was like one box. And actually, the original shipment, all the toads died, so they sent another one. And it was like 17 or 24. It was some small number of animals that was released originally. And so you'd imagine that bottleneck would cause problems. The toads definitely have problems. One of the studies that Rick Shine and company did showed that the toads are suffering because their limb bones are differently shaped than the parental population, and they're using them in this different way. By the time these things are a few years old, most of them have arthritis that is unknown from other amphibian species, virtually unknown, where actually the bones of a skeletal specimen can show evidence of this arthritic condition. Whether that is somehow connected to the founding population, I don't know, but it hasn't slowed them down. These things are not like the Florida panthers that are having all this kind of trouble because of a small founding population. They seem to be doing quite well. So whether that was luck and whether it would be representative more broadly, I don't know. There has been some work, and I can't regurgitate it for you, but there has been some work looking at success versus founding population size for vertebrate introductions, and that would be one place to look for those kinds of signals. All right. Thank you all. Thank you. Hey, Mimi. How are you? How's it going?
Good. How are you doing?
Good to see you.
Good to see you too.
Hanging in there?
Hey, Karen. How are you? I gotta whisk him away though. Okay.
Do I get to bring my water?
Yes, yes. So, do you know the paper that Alodi and John Oastler just published?
The UW folks?
Yeah. They just published this global analysis of basically like 1,600 phenotypic changes across plant and animal species for urban landscapes around the world.
Okay.
Really,
I'll have to take a look.
yeah, I'll send it to you.
I actually competed with John for that job way back in the day.
I can turn this off if you want.
Okay, I'll take a look. Max is, my student Max is actually, he's applied to work with me to go to work. Do you? All right. Bad crazy? All right. We know that academics come in two kinds of crazy. Thank you, Melanie. Thank you. So let's talk about that thing.
Yeah. Oh,
All right.
yeah, no, yeah, you saw that.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm just, I don't know how the hell you do it with admin. I'm heading two search committees and
I also
Where is
want to
it?
talk to you about diversity training for the museum. I just want to pick your brain.
oh yeah, sure, I'll be happy to. Okay.